The nearly landlocked Baltic Sea, situated in northern Europe, saw civilizations flourish on its banks for nearly a millennium, like the Mediterranean of ancient days. Despite their ethnic and cultural diversity, the peoples bordering the Baltic Sea have one thing in common. They all gained power and wealth through maritime supremacy. You'll discover these seafaring peoples during our cruise to the capitals on the Baltic. At Dunkirk, on the northern coast of France, we board the Shota Roustavelli, a 20,000-ton Ukrainian ship. Built in the late 60s in the naval shipyards of ex-East Germany, the Shota Roustavelli belonged to the heyday of working-class cruises on the Black Sea during the Soviet era. The Shota, as the crew fondly calls her, is slowly towed to the lock that separates the harbor from the high sea. The outdated decor on the bridge should not take away from the fact that the Ukrainians are excellent sailors, like the Russians. They're very often recruited on large sailing ship cruises because of their reputed skill and background. While the French passenger crew carefully prepares for the first stopover, the Norwegian pilot who boarded during the wee morning hours helps the Shota commander sail cautiously up the fjord to Oslo. Over 9 centuries ago, another navigator, Viking Harald Sigurdsson, wary of traveling the world, sailed to the end of this same fjord. The year was 1048. Sigurdsson liked the spot and decided to establish the capital of his kingdom here. Thus Oslo, the oldest of the Scandinavian capitals, was born. For centuries, Oslo was relegated to a secondary position, first by the powerful Hanseatic League, which preferred Bergen to control trade on the Baltic Sea, and secondly by the Scandinavian sovereigns, who kept Norway annexed to the Kingdom of Denmark and Sweden, but preferred Copenhagen and Stockholm.
Vive la France!
Norway did not regain the independence it had lost in 1380 until 1905. Oslo was then named capital. To this day, Oslo, rebuilt by King Christian IV, is first and foremost a busy port, still dominated by the Renaissance-style Akershus fortress. Norway's economy was centered around the sea until the 20th century, when oil deposits were discovered in the North Sea, completely transforming the country. The Bygdøy Peninsula near Oslo regroups several museums devoted to the country's greatest moments in maritime adventure. The Kon-Tiki Museum chronicles the work of scientist and navigator Thor Heyerdahl, who crossed the oceans on his raft Kon-Tiki, then on a reed boat called Ra, to prove that ancient civilizations could have made transoceanic contacts on similar vessels. Only just a few yards away is a museum devoted to the polar exploration ship Fram. Based on observations of flotsam from the Jeannette found in Greenland, although the ship had sunk in Siberia, Fridtjof Nansen developed a theory on Arctic currents. To prove the validity of his theory, Nansen had the Fram built. In 1893, the Fram left Oslo on its first expedition to the North Pole.
It was Nansen who asked Colin Archer to build a ship, almost like an egg and very, very strong. And he hoped that a wet soap would slip away, that instead of being screwed down by the ice, it would be lifted up by the ice, freeze into the ice and to sea. And after about a year and a half, he realized they wouldn't cross the North Pole. So that's why he decided that he would leave the ship with one companion. And he told the captain, you go on, do your oceanographical and meteorological experiments and things, and we would like to be independent. Each of them had a kayak, a sleigh and skis, and we'll try to get to the North Pole, and then we'll see how we get on. I mean, what courage, it's incredible, into the unknown.
Nansen probably owes his determination to his dormant Viking side. One wonders if, as he trekked through the polar temperatures at Leffer, he was thinking about the son of Eric the Red, who, with 35 companions, discovered America exactly 5 centuries before Christopher Columbus. Viking in Old Norse means sea expedition. In the early 9th century, the main reason the Vikings were able to travel to the west was their exceptional sailing ships. The items on display in the Bygdøy Museum, a dragon-headed prow, a sled, and a chariot, were mainly found at the Osberg Digs, where a 22-meter-long oak boat was uncovered.
Well, first of all, they made the long voyages only in the summer months. And they were navigating with the sun and the stars and the moon, and they had a very funny stone, a thin one, which when they took it against the horizon, even if it was not sunshine, they could trace where the sun was on the sky to navigate with that. And they were navigating either with a big square sail, or they were rowing. The ship here, the Oseberg ship, was found in 1904, and it was used for the funeral, anyway, of a lady of high rank, but possibly a queen called Åsa. So they took the ship ashore, and on top of the ship, in the grave, in a funeral chamber, this queen or this lady of high rank was buried with a female servant who was sacrificed for her. And around the ship, she got with her 12 horses, oxes, different races of dogs, a carriage, 4 sleighs, and everything she might need for her future life.
The Shota leaves Oslo and heads back down the fjord to the high sea.
Как любой глава семьи хочет знать, что происходит в его семье, так и я. Если я могу помочь чем-то, я стремлюсь помочь этому.
I'm like the head of any household. I need to know what is going on in the family. If I can help, I will. Anyway, because of the way we live on board, we have to know what's happening in the family and how to go about helping everyone in the best way.
We're
not really a separate entity, even though we represent one country, the Ukraine. We have lots of nationalities on board: Georgians, Armenians, Belarusians, and Russians.
Слава Богу. Артистка.
Day and night, the Shota sails along the Baltic Sea at the same pace. We're already 1,500 kilometers from Dunkirk. On deck, passengers prepare for the next stop in Copenhagen, while down below in the engine room the men bustle about in the din and heat.
На судне я работаю главным механиком.
I am the chief engineer on board. I am in charge of maintaining and repairing the main and auxiliary engines in the engine room. And I also buy spare parts.
It's fascinating how different yet parallel worlds exist on a cruise ship. 2 decks above the engine room, a rehearsal is underway. Symbols are not always synonymous with size. While so many capital cities are known for their gigantic monuments or buildings, the Eiffel Tower, the Statue of Liberty, the Colosseum, or Red Square, Copenhagen owes its fame to a simple little bronze statue, a few centimeters high. The Little Mermaid, based on the Hans Christian Andersen character, will always be an attraction. The name Copenhagen, which means Merchant's Harbor, evokes the city's trading tradition, dating from its beginning in 1167. Despite its wide avenues and large squares, such as the one at the Amalienborg Royal Palace, Copenhagen remains a medium-sized metropolis where steamships are moored near the city center. Copenhagen is as colorful as the uniform of the Royal Guards. In the center of the old town, the red brick buildings mingle with green copper steeples whose unusual shapes splash across the blue sky. In a tiny alley is one of the oldest smørrebrød restaurants in Copenhagen. These famous sandwiches that Danish love so much were served here in the late 18th century. The sandwich is made of a thin slice of rye bread topped with salmon or herring. Regulars know that Line makes the tastiest and especially the most authentic smørrebrød in all Copenhagen.
Here we have all kinds of herring, with curry, spiced, marinated or well cooked. There are the fish too, and the famous smørrebrød called the veterinarian's dish. We prepare simple, traditional smørrebrøds, which have existed in Denmark for years. It came from the farmers in the countryside. As time went by, it became a popular trendy dish, and it is now even more sophisticated with more toppings. We carry on the tradition and prepare them just like in the old days, in the same simple way.
Bicycles rule in Copenhagen. They're parked all over town, and you can borrow one for free, like a shopping cart. You can take a bike here and turn it in somewhere else. Copenhagen has its Latin Quarter too. The narrow streets lined with bookstores and art galleries lead into tiny squares overrun with outdoor cafes during fine weather. In the late 17th century, the Nien Canal was built to give ships access to the Royal Square. As trade developed, warehouses and houses for merchants flourished on both sides of the canal. They were soon turned into inns for sailors. Today, restaurants and coffee houses occupy the colorful buildings at Nien. The quays, dotted with ancient rigs, become what Copenhagen residents call the world's longest bar in the summer. As the setting sun floods its gilded rays on Copenhagen steeples, we leave the harbor and head north to Stockholm, our next stop. As our journey continues on the Baltic, we begin an astonishing excursion into the Stockholm archipelago, what sailors poetically call the Garden of 1,000 Pitfalls. Most of the 30,000 odd islands and islets extending up to 70 kilometers off the coasts are uninhabited. Only about 100 of them welcome visitors, and so Stockholm residents can enjoy their own summer paradise close by. Noon in Stockholm. Time for the changing of the guard at the Royal Palace. While these costumed soldiers perform in style, several feet away in the heart of the city center, young people, oblivious to the official pomp and ritual, hope the salmon will bite. People say Stockholm's waters are extremely pure. Built on 14 islands, Stockholm is called the Venice of the North, or the Floating City. On one of these islands, Gamla Stan, stands the Royal Palace, a huge quadrilateral structure with 608 rooms.
We are now inside the Royal Palace in Stockholm, and we are inside what is the dining room of the Royal Palace. And as you can see here, the decoration is very rich, especially in the ceiling. And it is a decoration that dates back to the 17th century in a very Baroque style.
Portraits and items belonging to Bernadotte are displayed in one of the palace rooms. Former general of the French Empire, elected Crown Prince of Sweden in 1810 under the name Charles XIV, Bernadotte and his young wife from Marseille, Désirée Clary, founded a dynasty. The last descendant is the present king, Charles XVI.
This is a dining hall which is still used. The king, he will give between 6 and 8 official dinners every year. Now it is a museum. When it is not used, it is like a museum. You can visit, as a guest, you can visit these rooms. But they will close then, of course, when the king uses them. So it's a very living royal palace. It's a very living museum.
Lining the quay as if on display, the magnificent turn-of-the-century steamships with their huge red smokestacks recall the aesthetics and style of the large steamers of the day, like the Titanic. But Stockholm Harbor was marked by another shipwreck.
It all started with Anders Franzén, who found the ship in the middle of the harbor of Stockholm. Once it came up with a piece of blackened oak, and that indicated that below there was a big ship or something very old waiting for him, because most ships at that time was made of oak, and oak, having been so long in water, had blackened, so that was an important find. And Anders Franzén made everybody interested. They sent divers down and immediately found out that it should have been the Vasa that sank in 1628 on her maiden voyage in the middle of the Stockholm. And with this, the story of the Vasa, her second life started.
The Vasa was the costliest and most lavishly decorated warship built in Sweden at that time. The hull was made from 1,000 oak trees. It was equipped with 64 large-bore guns, had masts 50 meters tall, and decorated with hundreds of gilded painted sculptures. On the day of its maiden voyage, Stockholm residents crowded at the docks witnessed the tragedy. What caused the shipwreck? The wind, poorly mounted guns, or the construction itself? The Dutch naval architect had built many other ships, but the Vasa was different. It was an experimental ship, which was larger, heavier, and carried heavier guns. Actually, Swedish King Gustavus II Adolphus, who wanted a supreme weapon for his country, saw his political dreams dashed to pieces by the laws of physics and the whims of the weather. Once again, the Shota takes to the seas, this time heading eastwards to Russia and St. Petersburg. We arrive in Russia in the morning. At the harbor entrance, the Leningrad legacy is still visible in capital letters. Passengers and crew members impatiently await the stopover in St. Petersburg, but for different reasons. For the former, the city evokes the Tsar palaces, while for the latter, it often is the sole occasion after months at sea to see wives or fiancés left at the other end of Russia or the Ukraine. On board the Shota and on the docks, there's the wait. Then happy reunions. St. Petersburg is first and foremost the city of Peter the Great, a city that emerged from the marshes of the Gulf of Finland in the early 18th century, thanks to the Tsar's unshakable determination. Peter the Great's plan was mainly political and military. By building his capital on the Neva River, he wanted to distance himself from Moscow and the Kremlin intrigues, and underscore his opposition to the powerful Kingdom of Sweden that occupied this region of the Baltic. But building his capital city in stone and not wood, as was the Russian tradition then, Peter the Great expressed his fascination for the West, which he discovered before becoming Tsar. Peter the Great's successors continued his work. For 2 centuries, from 1703, the year the Peter Paul Fortress was erected, to the day in October 1917 when the battlecruiser Aurora fired on the Winter Palace, marking the end of Tsarist rule, St. Petersburg grew into one of the world's finest cities. The Tsars had summer residences built in the neighboring countryside. The Empress Elizabeth commissioned Italian architect Bartolomeo Rastrelli, designer of the Winter Palace, to build a summer home in Tsarskoye Selo. The palace in Tsarskoye Selo is a Baroque masterpiece, with its blue and white 300-meter facade punctuated with columns and statues. In 1937, the city was renamed Pushkin in honor of the poet who had studied there. Near the palace, in the garden of the high school Pushkin attended, stands a statue of the scholar in his school uniform. This is where we met Anatoly Sergeyev. Today he's retired but writes. During his long trips at sea working as a sailor, he discovered the joys of writing.
Дело-то в том, что я ведь военный моряк, и многое из того, что я видел и знаю.
I was a sailor in the Navy, so I don't know if I can tell you about the things I saw and heard.
Я могу только сказать, что плавал по Белому морю.
I sailed on the White Sea, the Barents Sea, and the Kara Sea.
In a manner of speaking, Anatoly owes his calling to Peter the Great, since he created the powerful Russian fleet on the Baltic. The Navy Museum well illustrates this period of the city's history. Here we discover the model of the Ingermanland, Peter the Great's favorite boat. Here we have a painting of a battle against the Swedes at the mouth of the Neva River. And last of all, a model of the ancient Admiralty shipyards built during the city's early years. Foreign talent was used in architecture and dance. The St. Petersburg School of Ballet was directed by Frenchman Charles Didelot in 1801, then Marius Petipa in 1847. They paved the way for the amazing Ballet Russe promoted by Sergei Diaghilev and choreographed by Michel Fokine.
Fokine brought the best painters of the day with him. Bakst, Benoit, Dobozhinsky, Karovia, everybody worked for the Russian seasons. They were like moths drawn to a flame. They were drawn to Fokine because they sensed that he was a new kind of choreographer, that he was doing completely new things. And it was the beginning of the 20th century. Deep down in the Russian soul, there is a great aspiration for dancing, for all things aesthetic and artistic. I think the Russian soul is enigmatic.
Diaghilev, Fokine, Dostoevsky, Gogol, Pushkin, Tchaikovsky, Rimsky-Korsakov. The list of famous St. Petersburg natives is endless. Anatoly the sailor or Victor the street singer will no doubt remain anonymous, but they showed us a glimpse of the Russian soul.
Сначала, конечно, я открыл Пушкина.
First I discovered Pushkin. I learned to read with Pushkin. During the Leningrad blockade, the only books we had was the set of Pushkin's entire works. I didn't go to school in the winter. I stayed at home and read Pushkin. Thanks to Pushkin, I discovered Peter the Great and Pugachev, and lots of others.
ни ветра не ласковый, новогодняя ночь, где придет нежной сказкою и хрустит снежком до весны подожди.
Under the gilded palace ceiling, we meet up with the Shota passengers who have come to attend a folk performance. This is early summer, and it's still daylight late in the evening. During these white nights, people stroll along the Neva, namely near the Hermitage Palace.
Здесь последнее счастье летит, где мечтаешь и творишь. И пусть Париж всегда Париж, но Питер, мама, вечно Питер.
They are all waiting for the bridges to open at 2 a.m.
When you work at night, you see twice as many things, or so people say. Of course, when I'm busy raising the bridges, I hardly have time to be romantic.
Once the bridges open, a convoy of ships sail down the Neva, perhaps sailing over the rivers and through the locks all the way to Moscow. Some will even go as far as the shores of the Caspian Sea. In the wee morning hours, the Shota leaves St. Petersburg. Taking the channel linking the harbor to the Baltic Sea, the vessel heads westward for the first time during the cruise, to Estonia. We enter the harbor of Tallinn, capital of Estonia, amidst an impressive armada of ferry boats. When the country broke ties with the Soviet Union and gained its independence in the early 90s, it naturally moved closer to Finland. The two countries share the same language, Finnish. These ferries operate mainly between Tallinn and Helsinki, making tourism the country's main resource. Except for a short interlude from 1919 and 1940, during which Estonia enjoyed its first fragile independence, the history of this tiny country has been marked by power struggles among their larger neighbors, the Teutonic Knights, Swedes or Russians. As a sign of times and symbol of the changes in this country, the Parliament sits across from the Orthodox Alexander Nevsky Cathedral, erected in 1894 by the former Russian rulers. The Gothic City Hall stands on the Grand Square, a favorite spot today for tourists and young Estonians. Though a wave of modernism sweeps over this medieval decor, the Estonians still feel attached to their customs. Every year, folk groups from all of the provinces gather for a festival.
We're from the Setu minority group. Each ethnic group, no matter how small, has the right to its language and culture. Even though the European idea is a good thing, I think each ethnic group should keep its traditions.
In the Middle Ages, the main street that led to the harbor was the city's main trading thoroughfare. Imported salt, herring, iron ore, grain, furs, and flax for export passed along this artery. Once again, we re-embark on the Shota and pursue our journey eastwards, this time towards Poland.
I supervise all the food departments, and I'm also the official interpreter. Before, I was an interpreter guide. I accompanied French groups visiting the Soviet Union. I applied to work on a boat and was hired for a while as an interpreter. That's how I became a sailor. I've been working aboard the Shota for 14 years. You slowly become part of a family, since you spend most of your time on board, about 8 or 9 months out of the year. It's like a separate little state, or a country on the water. When we go on vacation for 2, 3, or 4 months, then we really see what is going on in the country. Here we're far away. You can't keep up with things. The Soviet Union is still my country.
We arrive in Poland. The pilot of the Gdynia harbor comes on board to supervise the often delicate approach maneuvers on the Baltic Sea.
The sea is the sea. It can always surprise you with something unexpected. This is true for the Baltic or the Mediterranean. The Baltic Sea is much more regulated than the Mediterranean. The Baltic is regulated by channels, buoys, and the fact that it is shallower than the Mediterranean.
Небольшие по сравнению с глубинами Средиземного моря.
Оставьте это на этом самом.
We leave the port of Gdynia for nearby Gdansk. What did the name Gdansk mean for most people prior to the 80s? Not even a name on the map of Poland. In just a few months, cameras from all over the world crowded at the entrance of the naval shipyard. Lech Wałęsa's trade union Solidarity, supported by a Polish pope, defied the communist authorities and led to its downfall. For foreigners, Gdansk remains the home of solidarity. Yet the city possesses its own heart and soul, forged over years of history. The architectural heritage accumulated throughout its history was totally destroyed by Nazi troops at the start of the Second World War. For the Germans, Gdansk was still Danzig, the medieval city. In the years following the war, the city was slowly reconstructed street by street, house by house, as it was originally. When you take the Royal Street, you rediscover the city which, like Bergen and Lübeck, was one of the most powerful centers in the Hanseatic League, a harbor association that controlled trade on the Baltic. The Gdansk residents were mostly German, and the architecture is more reminiscent of Flanders than Poland. For centuries, Gdansk attracted humanists and scholars from all over Europe, drawn to its intellectual and cultural life. It was also the birthplace of famous people such as astronomer Johannes Hevelius, physicist Gabriel Fahrenheit, and philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer. The merchant elite gathered inside the famous Artist Court building, the inside of which is topped with a Gothic vault. One of the major items in the hall is a gigantic glazed stove said to be the tallest in the world. These glazed decorations depict the merchants of that era. Along the walls, we still find the benches where the merchants held their meetings. Some bear the names of their members. Gdansk, like all the cities we visited on this cruise, reigned supreme on the banks of the Baltic. Hanging from the hall ceilings are models of the vessels from yore, evoking the glorious days of the past. The heyday of working-class cruises on the Black Sea during the Soviet era. The Shota, as the crew fondly calls her, is slowly towed to the lock that separates the harbor from the high sea. The outdated decor on the bridge should not take away from the fact that the Ukrainians are excellent sailors, like the Russians. They're very often recruited on large sailing ship cruises because of their reputed skill and background. While the French passenger crew carefully prepares for the first stopover, the Norwegian pilot who boarded during the wee morning hours helps the Shota commander sail cautiously up the fjord to Oslo. Norway's economy was centered around the sea until the 20th century, when oil deposits were discovered in the North Sea, completely transforming the country. The Bygdøy Peninsula near Oslo regroups several museums devoted to the country's greatest moments in maritime adventure. The Kon-Tiki Museum chronicles the work of scientist and navigator Thor Heyerdahl, who crossed the oceans on his raft Kon-Tiki, then on a reed boat called Ra, to prove that ancient civilizations could have made transoceanic contacts on similar vessels. Only just a few yards away is a museum devoted to the polar. For centuries, Oslo was relegated to a secondary position, first by the powerful Hanseatic League, which preferred Bergen to control trade on the Baltic Sea, and secondly by the Scandinavian sovereigns, who kept Norway annexed to the Kingdom of Denmark and Sweden, but preferred Copenhagen and Stockholm.
Vive la France!
Norway did not regain the independence it had lost in 1380 until 1905. Oslo was then named capital. To this day, Oslo, rebuilt by King Christian IV, is first and foremost a busy port, still dominated by the Renaissance-style Akershus fortress. The nearly landlocked Baltic Sea, situated in northern Europe, saw civilizations flourish on its banks for nearly a millennium, like the Mediterranean of ancient days. Despite their ethnic and cultural diversity, the peoples bordering the Baltic Sea have one thing in common. They all gained power and wealth through maritime supremacy. You'll discover these seafaring peoples during our cruise to the capitals on the Baltic. At Dunkirk, on the northern coast of France, we board the Shota Roustavelli, a 20,000-ton Ukrainian ship. Built in the late 60s in the naval shipyards of ex-East Germany, the Shota Roustavelli belonged to Over 9 centuries ago, another navigator, Viking Harald Sigurdsson, wary of traveling the world, sailed to the end of this same fjord. The year was 1048. Sigurdsson liked the spot and decided to establish the capital of his kingdom here. Thus Oslo, the oldest of the Scandinavian capitals, was born.